The Memoirs of Colonel John S. Mosby. Chapter 4. Johnston's Retreat from Harper's Ferry. The first great military blunder of the war was committed by Johnston in evacuating Harper's Ferry. Both Jackson and General Lee, who was then in Richmond organizing the army and acting as military advisor, were opposed to this. They wanted to hold it, not as a fortress with a garrison, but to break communication with the West, and a salient for an active force to threaten the flank of an invading army. On April 27th, Stonewall Jackson was ordered to the command of Harper's Ferry, which the militia had seized a few days before. Harper's Ferry is situated in a gap in the Blue Ridge through which flow the waters of the Potomac and the Shenandoah. John Brown had seized the place in his rebellion. The fact that he tried to start a slave insurrection in a region where there were few slaves is proof that he was a monomaniac. But Harper's Ferry was a place of great strategic value for the Confederates, as the railroad and canal on the Potomac from Washington, 50 miles below, passed through the gap. It was a salient position. Its possession by the Confederates was a menace to the North and broke direct communication between the capital and the West. A strategic offensive on the border was the best policy to encourage Southern sentiment in Maryland and defend the Shenandoah Valley from invasion. A Virginian lieutenant, Roger Jones, had been stationed at Harper's Ferry with a small guard to protect the property of the government. He remained until the force coming to capture the place was in sight, then set fire to the buildings and retreated. His example in holding the position to the last extremity was not followed by the Confederates. When Jackson arrived at the scene of his command, without waiting for instructions, he prepared to hold it by fortifying Maryland Heights. "I am of the opinion," he wrote to General Lee, "that this place should be defended with the spirit that actuated the defenders of Thermopylae, and if left to myself, such is my determination." General Lee was in accord with Jackson's sentiments. Now Jackson did not mean that Harper's Ferry should be held as a fortress to stand a siege, nor that he would stay there and die like the Spartans in the pass, but that he would hold it until a likelihood of its being surrounded by superior numbers was imminent. There was no prospect of this being the case, for no investing force was near. The best way to defend the Shenandoah Valley was to hold the line of the Potomac as a menace to Washington. Major Deas, who had been sent to Harper's Ferry as an inspector of the Confederate War Department, thought that the troops showed an invincible spirit of resistance. On May 21st, he wrote, "I have not asked Colonel Jackson his opinion on the subject, but my own is that there is force enough here to hold the place against any attack which, under the existing state of affairs, may be contemplated." And on May 23rd, the day before McDowell's army at Washington crossed into Virginia, he reported that there were about 8,000 troops at Harper's Ferry, and the outposts, including 5 companies of artillery and a naval battery, and that 7,300 were then able to go into battle well armed. The naval batteries, he said, under Lieutenant Fauntleroy, are placed on the northern and southern salients of the village of Harper's Ferry and envelop by their fire the whole of the town of Bolivar and the approaches of the immediate banks of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. The cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Jeb Stuart is in very good condition and quite effective. All the infantry regiments are daily drilled in the school of the soldier and company, and valuable assistance is received in this respect from the young men who have been instructed at the military school at Lexington. Neither Jackson nor Major Deas knew of any immediate danger of Harper's Ferry being invested. On May 24th, in accordance with orders from the Confederate government at Montgomery, General Joseph E. Johnston assumed command at the ferry, and in a few days, Jackson was given a brigade of 5 Virginia regiments. The outposts at the ferry then extended from Williamsport on the Potomac to Point of Rocks on the river below. Johnston at once submitted a memorandum to Richmond on the conditions at Harper's Ferry, which displayed the caution for which he became distinguished. He seemed to have little confidence in his troops and thought the position could be easily turned from above or below, taking no account of the fact that he might turn the flank of an enemy who was flanking him. Johnston asked instructions from General Lee in relation to the manner in which the troops he commanded should be used. And on May 28th, he again wrote in the same tone of despair, "If the Commander-in-Chief has precise instructions to give, I beg to receive them early. I have prepared means of transportation for a march. Should it be decided that the troops should constitute a garrison, this expense can be recalled," which shows he was getting ready for a retreat. With this letter, Johnston enclosed a memorandum from a staff officer, Major Whiting, in which the latter spoke of troops that were gathering at Carlisle and Chambersburg, intimating that in the event of the advance of this force, it might be necessary to move out to prevent being shut up in a cul-de-sac. But such a thing was too remote and contingent to constitute a danger of investment at that time. No place is absolutely impregnable. Gibraltar has been captured. The answer Johnston should have received to this request for orders was that he did not command a garrison to defend a fortress, but an active force in the field, and that Harper's Ferry might be held as a picket post. The discipline of Johnston's troops ought to have been as good as that of the 3 months' men that Patterson was collecting at Chambersburg, 50 miles away. In addition to the cadets of the Virginia Military Institute who were drilling his regiments, Johnston had in his army at least 10 officers who had lately resigned from the U.S. Army. Nearly all of the field officers of Jackson's brigade had been educated at the Military Institute, and several had been officers in the Mexican War. Their conduct in battle a few weeks afterwards shows how much Johnston had underrated them. The men were volunteers full of enthusiasm for a cause and rendered cheerful obedience to orders. It was not necessary to drill such material into machines to make them soldiers. Johnston complained of the want of discipline of his army and the danger of being surrounded by a superior force. The force that was coming to surround the ferry was a specter. McDowell's and Patterson's armies were 50 miles away and 100 miles apart. At the request of Governor Pierpont, a few regiments had crossed the Ohio, but McClellan's headquarters were still at Cincinnati. Any movement from that direction would naturally be through central Virginia, towards Richmond, in cooperation with McDowell. Johnston continued to show great anxiety about his position and wrote about it several times to General Lee. But neither Lee nor President Davis could see the danger as he saw it, and on June 7th, General Lee, to calm his fears, wrote him, "He, the President, does not think it probable that there will be an immediate attack by troops from Ohio. General N.J. Garnett, C.S. Army, with a command of 4,000 men, has been dispatched to Beverly to arrest the progress of troops. Colonel McDonald has also been sent to interrupt the passage of troops over the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It is hoped by these means you will be relieved from an attack in that direction, and will have merely to meet an attack in front from Pennsylvania." In the meantime, reinforcements were going to Beauregard and Johnston almost daily. Wise and Floyd had been sent to the Kanawha Valley to counteract any movement there, and Garnett, with 4,000 troops, had been sent to northwest Virginia. Patterson's was the only force from which Johnston could expect an attack, and as he would have to make detachments from it to guard his communications, Patterson could not be much superior in numbers when the collision should come. General Lee, as advisor to the War Department, was really the de facto Secretary of War and directed all operations in the field. He had selected Manasses Junction as a strategic point for the concentration of troops on account of its being in connection with the valley. On return from Manasses Junction, to relieve Johnston of anxiety about his flank being turned, Lee wrote to him that he had placed Colonel Ewell in advance at Fairfax Courthouse and Colonel Eppa Hunton at Leesburg on the Potomac, each with a force of infantry and cavalry in reservation, who would inform him of any movement to his rear. But Johnston continued uneasy, and, although he was receiving reinforcements, he again wrote that he had heard that Patterson had 10,000 troops at Chambersburg, that some of McClellan's troops had reached Grafton, and he apprehended a junction of all of those forces against him. He should at least have waited for the development of such a plan, and then, instead of retreating, have taken the offensive to defeat it. Johnston's suggestion meant the abandonment of the valley. Patterson, who was organizing the force at Chambersburg, was a political general, only remembered for having allowed the force he commanded in the Shenandoah Valley to render no service at a critical time. Patterson proposed to capture Harper's Ferry, which, of course, General Scott was very willing to do. But the only support Scott could promise from Washington was to make a demonstration towards Manasses to prevent reinforcements going to the valley and to send a force of 2,500 on a secondary expedition up the Potomac. As the ferry was of great strategic value as an outpost, Scott warned Patterson of the desperate resistance he might expect from the Confederates. He did not suspect that the Confederates were then packing up to leave. On June 14th, the Confederates began the evacuation of Harper's Ferry and retreated 10 or 12 miles to Charlestown. No movement had been made against them from any direction. Several regiments had just arrived. There were about 3,000 militia at Winchester, and a force of the enemy had retreated from Romney. On June 13th, after repeated requests for instructions about holding Harper's Ferry, which showed clearly a desire to shift the responsibility for it, the War Department wrote him the conditions on which the place should be evacuated. You have been heretofore instructed to use your own discretion as to retiring from your position at Harper's Ferry and taking the field to check the advance of the enemy. As you seem to desire, however, that the responsibility of your retirement should be assumed here, and as no reluctance is felt to bear any burden which the public interest may require, you can consider yourself authorized, whenever the position of the enemy shall convince you that he is about to turn your position and thus deprive the country of the services of yourself and the troops under your command, to destroy everything at Harper's Ferry. Johnston seems to have met this letter at Charlestown while it was on the way, and did not wait for it at the ferry. Johnston's report says he met a courier from Richmond with a dispatch authorizing him to evacuate Harper's Ferry at his discretion. The dispatch he received had no such instructions. The conditions on which he was authorized to abandon the place had not arisen. No enemy was threatening to turn his position. On June 15th, Patterson crossed the Maryland line. His leading brigade was commanded by Colonel George H. Thomas, a Virginian, who was an officer in the 2nd Cavalry under Lee. It had been expected that he would go with the people of his native state. On the 16th, his brigade waded the Potomac. When Patterson heard that Harper's Ferry had been abandoned, he was incredulous and thought it was a ruse, giving Joe Johnston a credit he himself never claimed. The evacuation of Harper's Ferry before it was compelled by the presence of an enemy was not approved at Richmond, nor was it done to act in concert with any other force, as was then supposed. The victory at Bull Run a few weeks afterwards confirmed the impression that the movement had been made in cooperation with Beauregard. The latter knew nothing of such a purpose until he heard that the Confederates had lost their advantage and that the enemy held the key to the Shenandoah Valley. In plain words, it was a retreat. The evacuation of the post before there was any pressure to compel it made Johnston the innocent cause of a comedy at Washington. General Scott could not comprehend what could be the motive for it, except on the theory of its being a feigned retreat to capture Washington by a stratagem. No other reason could be conceived why the Confederates should surrender. After a part of his force had crossed the Potomac, to his surprise, Patterson received a telegram from General Scott on June 16th, ordering him to send at once to Washington all the regular troops, horse and foot, and Burnside's Rhode Island regiment. And on the 17th of June, Scott repeated the order and said, "We are pressed here. Send the troops I have twice called for without delay." Where the pressure could come from was a mystery to Patterson, as he knew that Johnston was still in the Shenandoah Valley, but the order was imperative, and he obeyed. "The troops were sent," he said, "leaving me without a single piece of artillery, and for the time with but one troop of cavalry, which had not been in service over a month." So the hostile armies retreated in opposite directions. Patterson recrossed the Potomac, and Johnston, unconscious of the alarm which his retreat had given in Washington, went on to Winchester. There was another amusing episode on June 16th as a result of the Harper's Ferry operations. In anticipation of the demonstration he was to make in favor of Patterson's predicted attack on Harper's Ferry, McDowell had sent General Schenck on the Loudon Railroad as an advance guard. When turning a curve near Vienna, a fire was opened on the train by what Schenck called a masked battery. The engine was in the rear, and as the engineer could not draw the train out of the range of fire, he detached the engine and disappeared under a full head of steam. So Schenck and his men had to walk back. Under a flag of truce, he asked permission to bury the dead and take care of the wounded. Schenck afterwards gained notoriety as U.S. Minister at London and was recalled. The only distinction he won in the war was as the inventor of the term masked battery. The battery that did so much damage was commanded by my schoolmate, Del Kemper. The whole country was greatly surprised by the news of the evacuation of Harper's Ferry. If Johnston had waited a day longer for the answer to his request for instructions, his retreat would have been a disobedience of orders. The conditions did not exist, in the opinion of the War Department, which would justify the evacuation. Johnston sent a reply in which he disclaimed a desire to shift responsibility, which was clearly inconsistent with his request for instructions. Harper's Ferry should have been held until danger was imminent. It must have been a position of strategic value, as well as of tactical strength, since it was held by 11,000 men against the Confederates and used as a base in the Gettysburg Campaign, and also when Early invaded Maryland. When the ferry was evacuated, McDowell's army was 50 miles below defending Washington, and Beauregard, in his front, fully occupied his attention. Patterson was at Hagerstown, had not crossed the Potomac, and had given no sign of doing so. Chapter 5. Battle of Manasses. The 1st Virginia Cavalry remained in the Shenandoah Valley until the 18th of July when, by forced marches, it was sent to join the army and take its part in the Battle of Manasses. When we left the valley, Stuart sent Captain Patrick's company to watch Patterson, whose army was in camp at Charlestown, and to screen the transfer of the army to the east of the Blue Ridge. It was well known that in a few days, the most of Patterson's regiments would be mustered out of service and would go home. It was evident that his prime object had been not to divert Johnston's army, but to avoid a collision. Patterson no doubt thought that he had effected his purpose and was content to rest where he was. Stuart's regiment arrived at the scene of the approaching battle and went into bivouac near Ball's Ford. The armies were so close together that there was a great deal of picket firing, and I remember very well the foreboding I felt when I lay down under a pine tree to rest beside Fount Beatty. When the bugle sounded on the morning of the 21st, in counting off, I was number 1 in the first set of 4s and rode at the head of the squadron that day. Nothing afterwards occurred in my military career that gives me more satisfaction to remember. A few days before 6 Colt pistols had been sent to our company, and Captain Jones had selected the men who were to have them. I was one of the 6. I don't know why. But to reconcile those who got no pistols, Jones told them that the 6 should be selected for the most dangerous work. Shortly after breakfast on the morning of the battle, Stuart sent Jones to make a reconnaissance over Bull Run. When we reached the woods where he thought the enemy might be, Jones called for the 6 men. We all responded and rode off into the woods to reconnoiter, but we didn't find an enemy, so the company recrossed the run. Our regiment was divided during the battle, and the squadron to which I belonged was placed under a Major Swan, a Marylander. Late in the day, when the enemy was in retreat, Swan halted us in a field within 50 yards of Kemper's guns, which were firing on the retreating troops. That was the very time for us to have been on the enemy's flank. I was near Captain Jones. He rose in his stirrups and said indignantly, "Major Swan, you can't be too bold in pursuing a flying enemy." But he made no impression on Swan. After dark, Swan marched us back over Bull Run, and I slept in a drenching rain in a fence corner. Swan did not get a man or a horse scratched. He did a life insurance business that day. Instead of Swan supporting the battery supported Swan. Afterwards, my last official act as adjutant of the company was to carry an order from Jones, who had become colonel, for Swan's arrest. We lay all the next day near the battlefield, and I rode over it, carrying a dispatch to Stewart at Sudley. But the first thing I did in the morning was to make a temporary shelter from the rain in a fence corner and write a letter to my wife. My dearest Pauline, there was a great battle yesterday. The Yankees are overwhelmingly routed. Thousands of them killed. I was in the fight. We at one time stood for 2 hours under a perfect storm of shot and shell. It was a miracle that none of our company was killed. We took all of their cannon from them. Among the batteries captured was Sherman's. Battle lasted about 7 hours. About 90,000 Yankees, 45,000 of our men. The cavalry pursued them till dark, followed 6 or 7 miles. I just snatched this moment to write. Am outdoors in a rain. Will write you all particulars when I get a chance. We start just as soon as we can get our breakfast to follow them to Alexandria. We made a forced march to get here to the battle, traveled about 65 miles without stopping. My love to all of you. In haste. Early on Tuesday morning, July 23rd, Stewart's regiment and Ely's brigade moved to Fairfax Courthouse and camped near there on opposite sides of the Alexandria Pike. Stewart's dispatch to General Johnston, who was still at Manasses, says we got there at 9:30 a.m. The country looked very much like Egypt after a flood of the Nile. It was strewn with the debris of McDowell's army. I again wrote to my wife and used paper and an envelope which the Zouaves had left behind. On it was a picture of a Zouave charging with a fixed bayonet and an inscription, "Up guards and at them," which is said to have been Wellington's order at Waterloo. The Zouaves were then charging on New York. Fairfax Courthouse, July 24th, 1861. My dearest Pauline, I telegraphed and wrote you from Manasses early the next morning after the battle. We made a forced march from Winchester to get to Manasses in time for the fight, traveled 2 whole days and 1 night without stopping, in the rain, and getting only 1 meal. We arrived the morning before the fight. It lasted about 10 hours and was terrific. When we were first brought upon the field, we were posted as a reserve just in rear of our artillery and directly within range of the hottest fire of the enemy. For 2 hours we sat there on our horses, exposed to a perfect storm of grape shot, balls, bombs, etc. They burst over our heads, passed under our horses, yet nobody was hurt. I rode my horse nearly to death on the battlefield, going backward and forward, watching the enemy's movements to prevent their flanking our command. When I first got on the ground, my heart sickened. We met Hampton's South Carolina Legion retreating. I thought the day was lost, and with it the Southern cause. We begged them, for the honor of their state, to return. But just then a shout goes up along our lines. Beauregard arrives and assures us that the day will be ours. This reanimated the troops to redouble their efforts. Our regiment had been divided in the morning. Half was taken to charge the enemy early in the action, and the remaining part, ours and Amelia Company, were held as a reserve to cover the retreat of our forces, if unsuccessful, and to take advantage of any favorable moment. When, late in the evening, the Yankees gave way, they seemed overwhelmed with confusion and despair. They abandoned everything: arms, wagons, horses, ammunition, clothing, all sorts of munitions of war. They fled like a flock of panic-stricken sheep. We took enough arms, accoutrements, etc., to equip the whole army. They were splendidly equipped, had every imaginable comfort and convenience which Yankee ingenuity could devise. The fight would not have been half so long had it been an open field one, but the Yankees were protected by a thick pine woods, so that it was almost impossible to get at them with the cavalry. They never once stood to a clash of the bayonet, always broke and ran. In the evening, when they gave way, the order was given to charge them. We were then in the distant part of the field. In a moment we were in full pursuit, and as we swept on by the lines of our infantry at full speed, the shouts of our victorious soldiers rent the air. We pursued them for 6 or 8 miles, until darkness covered their retreat. The whole road was blocked up with what they abandoned in their flight. All our regiment, in fact, nearly all the soldiers, now have splendid military overcoats which they took. I have provided myself very well. We took every piece of their artillery from them, 62 pieces, among them one of the finest batteries in the world. Their total loss cannot be less than 5,000. Our company is now equipped with Yankee tents. I am riding under one. We are also eating Yankee provisions, as they left enough to feed the army a long time. All of the Northern Congress came out as spectators of the fight. A senator was killed by a cannonball. Foster. All of our troops fought well, but the Virginia troops bore the brunt of the battle, especially Jackson's brigade. A Washington paper says they were scarce of ammunition, a lie, for we took enough from them to whip them over again. Our captain, who you know is an old army officer, complimented our company very much for their coolness and bravery in standing fire, said that we stood like old veterans. We were placed in the most trying position in which troops can be placed, to be exposed to a fire which you cannot return. There was scarcely a minute during the battle that I did not think of you and my sweet babes. But a truce to such thoughts. We are now marching on to bombard Washington City.
If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more content like this, be sure to take a shot at the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest BirdDogg content. And if you'd like to support the channel, for a limited time there's exclusive Civil War Diaries merchandise available in the video